Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be going over Chapter 7 and talking about data analysis and interpretation. So by now you are already starting to put your action research plan into place. You've started your intervention and you have started to collect data. So now we are going to think about what you are going to do as and after you finish collecting your data. So big ideas for this chapter, the difference between data analysis and interpretation, and then going through the different strategies and techniques that you can use for both qualitative data, quantitative data, how we think about mixed design and action research, and then thinking about how you can take your data analysis to interpretation and beyond. So at the start of the chapter, Mills, of course, gives another vignette, which hopefully is helpful for you just to see another example of the style and the modes that are common in action research. So I'm interested to see your thoughts on that and what you thought about this vignette, any ideas that you had or connections you had there. So when we are thinking about the phase after you have collected your data, we have two main areas here, data analysis and interpretation. So data analysis is when you are summarizing the data. You are summarizing it, and we'll go through a variety of different techniques as the text does as well. But this is what you want to do to try to create a full picture of the data. So in qualitative research, you're organizing the data, you're describing it, probably coding it, the narrative data such as your interviews, field notes. And then in quantitative, you are using your numerical summaries, which are descriptive statistics, and like counts, tally counts, things like that. We call that enumeration. And then data interpretation is a step beyond that, where after you have summarized the data, this is where you find meaning in it. Kind of like the difference between summarize and synthesize is where you are taking it to create like your interpretation of it, like, so what? So you have your codes, you have your descriptions, you have your descriptive statistics. Interpretation is when you take that into the actual meaning, and we'll talk about that today too. Okay, so one of the concepts that Mills introduces, this is a concept that you will see a lot in qualitative research, not just in action research, but in other types of research as well. And Sager also talks about it as well, is this idea of interim analysis. And this again fits with the theme that we have had about action research being iterative. So interim analysis is analysis that is ongoing throughout the data collection process. So in this technique, you are, and of course, like this is kind of, since you are the teacher researcher, since you are the one who is implementing the intervention, collecting the data and analyzing it, you can't help but engage in interim analysis because you're going to be thinking about it. And as teachers, we are reflecting on our data as well. And Sager does a really nice distinction too in the chapter about, oh, I should have put that as a reflection question. So if you have comments, you can put that in the perusal here. But the difference between how a teacher reflects on the data and how a teacher researcher analyzes the data when in the midst of an action research cycle. So there are some distinctions there. So I'm curious to hear if that shifted your thinking in any ways, as opposed to how you already view teaching as reflective, how reflecting on data is different from the data analysis process that you will be doing for this. But interim analysis is what researchers do as they are collecting data to make sure that the data is answering the questions that they are hoped to answer. Do they need to make any shifts or adjustments there? Again, that guides the data analysis. It sees, do you need to collect more? Have you collected enough of that type? And then you can also use this to start, of course, looking for patterns that you might be seeing, questions that you might be having. And so, of course, you're going to be doing this naturally throughout, but to make it more valid, you can do a memo. So as you are teaching, as you are doing your field notes, if you have an analytic, we call this an analytic memo, that is when you're not just describing what happens, but you think that you're noticing potentially a pattern that is coming across in either student interviews, in your field notes, in your test scores. You can write an analytic memo that is discussing an emerging pattern or theme or potential finding that you are seeing along the way. And so this interim analysis can happen after major rounds of data collection, maybe after a formative assessment, maybe you have decided that you are going to do observations Tuesday and Thursday, and perhaps at the end of the week, you've started to notice some things that you want to write about. You could write an analytic memo about that. So when we are talking about qualitative data analysis techniques, in many ways, the qualitative data analysis techniques are more time consuming. Not always, but many would argue that. So when you have your qualitative data, so this is your interview transcripts, these are your field notes, these are your open-ended surveys that students did, these are the photographs, these are the concept maps, the documents, the lesson plans, anything that has words or images is going to be your qualitative data. So the first step is to organize the data, and there's different ways that you could do this. You could do it chronologically, you could do it by data source type. You could do it by well, I guess that would be chronological. You could do it by student. So there are different ways that you can organize your data, but the first step is to organize them, label them, make sure that you have them in a way that is going to make it easy for you, easy-ish for you to go through and analyze it. So it might be making copies of it, it might be uploading it to like PDF, scanning them if they are student work, and making like case files, sometimes we call them. So you come up with a system, and organizing data is personal to the researcher. So this is something that we will be sharing with each other, things that are working for you. Sometimes you have to try something and then try something different to organize your data. Ensure that your data is complete and legible and that it is ready to analyze. So really this organizing step is a part of the analytic process. It's kind of like pre-analytic, but so once your data is analyzed, it's time for you to start engaging with the data in terms of analyzing it. And so again, analyzing it, this is when you are summarizing the data, especially with qualitative data, trying to summarize what it contains and doesn't contain also, as you will see in the chapter as well. So the first step is reading and memoing. This is when you are going to familiarize yourself with the data. In traditional qualitative research, we refer to this as immersing yourself in the data. So of course you were there. In many cases, it might be your reflection, you taught the lesson, but this is where you are kind of you're going from teacher to teacher researcher and going back and reading over it with fresh eyes for the purpose of looking for answers to your research question. And so as you're doing this, you can jot down any field notes or like analytic memos, like I mentioned, that you come up with. And even, a memo, you can make a voice, you can pull out your phone, you can do a voice recording for your memo. It doesn't have to necessarily be written, it could be a video. Qualitative researchers have so many different ways that they engage in this process to record this bulk of information. Next, describing, writing a descriptive detail of the participants' research setting. This is, for instance, like if you had a lesson plan, you, after reading, memoing, you might write up a descriptive memo describing the contents of that data source. Or if you had like an artifact from student work, you would describe the contents of it, again, for the purpose of analyzing in terms of summarizing the contents of it. And then of always keeping your research question in mind when you are analyzing. So that can kind of help you focus if you are feeling overwhelmed with the quantity of data. Go back to your research questions and reframe what it is you're looking for and use that to guide the description that you are doing. And then the last step is classifying, and this is when you are going to engage in coding, and we will talk about that. So reading and memoing, this is reading, you'll read through all the data. Memoing is when applicable. For some data sources, you might have a lot to say. For others, you might have less to say. That's okay. Describing would go for data sources that need a description, like I mentioned, the artifacts, a student project. And for instance, like if you had an interview transcript, you might write a quick description if there was anything else that you wanted to say about it, but some data sources might not need additional description. Like, for instance, like your teacher field notes, once you read through those, you can write an overall description of what you're noticing. And then the classifying and the coding, this is really useful for interview transcripts, for field notes as well, to identify themes and group the ideas together. So this is just the table from not Sager, from Mills about some suggestions on how you could organize your data. Like dates is something that's really important. Make sure that all of your data is dated, especially when you are looking over the arc of an action research cycle. You might want to see shifts in student practice. I know students don't like to write dates on stuff, so that's definitely something that I would need to check on. But here is, so I know you'll see this in the chapter, so I'm not going to say too much more about that, but Mills does have some ideas for how to organize your data. So I wanted to spend some time talking to you about coding. So coding is a method that qualitative researchers use to identify, to analyze, to identify the contents of a large piece of text. So you're breaking down the data into smaller units that you can use to further classify and sort the data. And it can help you identify group-related ideas and identify larger themes or patterns in the data that can help you always, again, address your research question. So an example might be if you're looking into study habits, you might have codes such as effort or distraction that come together. So Mills does have an excerpt in this chapter. He has an interview transcript, and then you can see in the margins is where the codes are. Now, codes, there's a lot of different types of codes, but for the purpose of action research, we are using what we call descriptive codes, where you're describing the content, or a content code where you're describing the content of the text or the interview or the field notes. And so you can think of this kind of like a hashtag. On social media, Twitter, traditionally, people would use a hashtag to give a short summary or a keyword to talk about the contents of that chunk of text. So you can see over here, there might be certain chunks of a text that have a few codes, and then there might be a large chunk of text that does not have codes. You don't need a code for every line of text. You need meaningful codes. When something happens in an interview transcript or in a field note or in a student artifact that is important to address your research question, you can come up with a code for it. And so you can, yeah. So that is what coding is. You can think of it kind of like the idea of using hashtags to summarize contents of short pieces of text. Now, after you have coded a piece of data, you can group together the codes to find categories and then larger themes that can serve as your findings. So Mills goes through several other different strategies you can use to analyze qualitative data. When we talk about themes, we're looking for reoccurring patterns that are coming up in your data sources. and in your quantitative sources as well. Coding the blocks of text that you can use to, again, analyze patterns and themes. When you're analyzing the interview, you could highlight key insights and then, group those together to identify your themes and patterns. You can also ask when engaging with the data, you can ask questions about the data to kind of help you make sense of what is there. An organizational review to look at different functions of a particular organization or theme. And then, of course, concepts maps. This diagram is showing you about how coding can happen. So here on the bottom, these would be the codes. So let's say that the teacher researcher coded their interview transcripts, and these are the codes that they came up with. Then they group them together to create categories, and then the categories can become patterns. So there's there's a lot of ways to do coding, but for our purposes, one way is to start off by what we call open coding and code the data and then group those codes together into larger categories. Or as we are going to practice with Sager, we will start with the categories and then go through the data and sort portions of the data that go within each category for coding. Okay, so that is qualitative. Now you also, I think everyone in here, yes, everyone has also chosen to collect some quantitative data. And so in the quantitative data that we are collecting is the numerical data. And in action research, we use descriptive statistics. Inferential statistics is outside the scope of what we are doing here because we're not trying to generalize or find evidence for statistical significance. So descriptive statistics, two main types that we will be using, central tendency and variability. So central tendency is talking about how close or when you have a data set, like let's say, for instance, students took a quiz, central tendency is describing the middle of that data. So the three types that we are talking about: mean, which is the average, mode, most frequently occurring, and then median, the middle score. Those are three different ways to talk about the midpoint. And then we also have variability. The text does a good job talking about how variability can add on to central tendencies. So you would use both of these for a data set. You might choose to use mean and then use, there's other types of variability, but for our purposes, we're doing standard deviation. And variability is talking about how spread the data is from the center. So standard deviation is a descriptive statistical approach to describing how far the other scores are spread from the mean. How far a particular score deviates from the average. And Mills talks about an example and how that can be helpful for you, talking about like teachers. If you are looking for strong results, you want a high mean and a small standard deviation, meaning that the average is as close to 100% as possible, and a small standard deviation would tell you that the majority of the students are within that range as well. So Mills didn't include a visual of standard deviation. He talked about it a little bit, but and I know a lot of you are probably very familiar. I will say too, Mills was writing this with the assumption that a lot of teachers are math phobic. I know that that's not the case in this class for the most part. So those of you who teach math or have a math background, this will definitely be an area where you can apply your your previous knowledge, if you know about statistics. But so here you can see the mean, and then the standard this is one standard deviation. So the standard deviation calculates a number that is a distance from the mean that encompasses 68% of the data. So that's, close to about 70%. And then it is the calculation within two standard deviations would be 95%, and then 99% will be within three standard deviations. So let's say, for instance, that you have on your, let's say your action research plan was wildly successful, and your final summative exam after the intervention, the class average was a 90%. If the standard deviation was 20, it couldn't be. So yeah, if your standard deviation, I don't even know if that's possible, but if your standard deviation was 20, that would mean that 70% of the class might have scored as low as within 70 and 110 again. And then 95% of the class would be between a 50 and so on. But if you had a very small standard deviation, let's say of 5 points, that would tell you that 70% of the class was in between 85 and 95%, which is a very strong score. And 95% of the class was in between 80 and 100, which would be really good. So a high mean and a small standard deviation would indicate really strong scores. Now, if you had a high mean and a large standard deviation, it might indicate that there is a group of students, like an outlier on the low end, that is making that standard deviation bigger. So variability can help you look at can help you identify if there are groups of students. One thing, this is kind of old school and it wasn't in the chapter, but if anyone knows how to do a box and whiskers, I also think that that could be really good to look at the spread, mean, like the lowest end, the highest end, and then the range there. Oh, that's something that wasn't mentioned here. Another measure of variability is range. So standard deviation is distance from the mean, and then range is just the lowest score to the highest score. So that's something that teachers do use. So that's something that can also be helpful to help you talk about the spread. Okay, and then combining qualitative and quantitative methods. So this table goes through some different approaches to data analysis when you have both data sources, and we do. So there's different ways that you can do this. So if it's convergent parallel, that means that you're collecting both the quantitative and the qualitative data simultaneously, and you analyze them together. They are of equal weight and importance. Explanatory sequential is when you first start with your quantitative data, and then you use qualitative data to follow up on outliers, maybe interviewing students who did poorly or who did really well on a formative assessment would be an example of that. And then exploratory sequential is when you have your qualitative data collected and analyzed first, and then based on that, you would use a quantitative instrument to help you test the themes that you have identified. These are kind of ideas that you might carry with you into your future cycle, especially this last one. You'll be in the first two more than likely, just due to the time constraints that we have for this semester. But these are useful to help you think about different techniques that you can use to approach data analysis and also data interpretation, how you can use both your qualitative and your quantitative data sources to make sense of each other and come up with ultimately your findings. So again, you can also come back to your triangulation matrix in those moments when you're trying to make sense of the data to see what the connections are across data sources. Now, Appendix C of the text has a bunch of examples of how to visually represent the data. So this is just a screenshot that I took from Appendix C. I did not upload it to Perusal, but I know everyone has the ebook now. So there are lots of examples that you can scroll through just to get an idea of, through looking at some of the visuals, it'll give you an idea of not only how you could organize your data, but how you could employ some of these different strategies, and how you can use those to move from analysis to interpretation. And it can help you also think about ethics. You can see here, they have student number, they took out names on their display, put in numbers, and how they are representing and displaying the results of a survey. So I encourage you to peruse Appendix C, and that's something that we'll be coming back to when we're writing up our action research and presenting it as well. But it can be helpful to see some examples to think about how you might engage in this process with your work. Okay, so moving from data analysis to data interpretation. So data analysis, you are summarizing the data. Interpretation, you are making meaning out of those summaries. So here are some grounding questions you can ask yourself after you have completed analysis and now that you are trying to interpret that analysis. So what do the findings mean for students and teaching and your teaching practices? And then what patterns are there, and try to explore those to create new understandings. So here are two excerpts from the Sager chapter 11. From Sager chapter 11 that's attached here. So this would be an example of data analysis. And then this would be an example of data interpretation. So okay, this really just shows how to go from data analysis to data interpretation. So, and this is just a screenshot, there's more, but in this example, they have the research question. There were three, this is just number one. So the researcher put the research question, and then all of their relevant findings from their data analysis are going underneath there. So they've done their data analysis, and now they're going back and copying, pasting the summaries or the analytic findings underneath the relevant research question. So here are all of the things that they identified in their data that answer this question. And then now the draft summary is when you are taking that, synthesizing it, and making meaning out on it. So these are like assertions that you can make based on the findings that you found. So that's an example to see what that might mean. And again, researchers have many different ways that they do this. We'll talk about a few. So again, and say Mills really drives this home. Start with an open mind, don't be hasty, don't jump to conclusions, and consider all the data, even if it contradicts your expectations. If that happens, be sure to write a memo, make a note of it. Look for patterns and relationships, pull out your triangulation matrix, and maybe play around with kind of like with the research question, maybe you put your findings into the triangulation matrix underneath the data sources, and then look across and see if there's any patterns there or connections or even divergences. So when you're looking for relationships, it can be similarities, differences, cause and effect relationships. It could be, what other kind of relationships? I'm sure there's others. If I find it, I'll put it in the comments. There's a whole theory about the different relationships that you can look for across the data. And then another thing that you can look for is, does the qualitative data reflect the quantitative? Do they diverge in some points? And that can help you strengthen your interpretation. And then you are asking yourself the why questions. If you see the similarities, why? If you see that they diverge, why? And kind of like the item analysis as well. So I'm thinking back to the example about the math facts, she noticed, okay, they're getting 60%, 70%, but then taking the time to go back, okay, what question did they miss? Why? What's going on here? Asks the so what question, How do your findings impact student learning in your classroom? And then going back to your intervention and your research questions as well. So here are some of the techniques. Extend the analysis. This is when you would like raise additional questions that are brought up based on your research. Use your expertise as the most important research instrument with your own experience to try to leverage the results and find patterns and themes there. Ask your critical friends. Think about the literature. So, do your findings align with the literature? Are they different? Reflect on that. And then theory. We haven't gotten into theory too much in this class. We do have our additional readings that you've been reading throughout the term in our NTSS chapter. So perhaps some of the theories there, you can find insight to help you, or again, in some of your readings. And make sure that your interpretation remains grounded in the data. So we talked a little bit about rushing to preliminary findings. So it is a lengthy process, the data analysis, but taking the time to go through that and check that. So taking the time to fully analyze the data. Of course, not ignoring contradictory data, skipping reflection, making sure that you are pausing, reflecting, making a video about it, memoing about it to reflect and really use your own insights. Um, you know, and sometimes reflection can even be like, writing down everything that you have, sleeping on it, coming back to it the next day. Overnight, your brain does amazing things and can hopefully help you come up with some insights. And then just using your tools. If you're interested to know about some of the qualitative research software, I use NVivo. So if you want to know about that, let me know. I can talk to you about that. Okay, so final thoughts. Of course, it's iterative, just like the action research process itself. Um, it's ongoing, and you may need to adjust your approach and refine your approach along the way. And, this is likely new for most of us in terms of analyzing our data. And so it does take practice. So it's definitely something where you should try some of the strategies and you will build your skills as you practice these approaches. So I can't wait to hear your thoughts on data analysis and interpretation and see what you find in your action research projects.